more than 15 days, we're still seeing the government shut down within the soil of the United States of America. On one hand, people are sick and tired of seeing the political polarization. It's not about which side should take the blame, the Republicans or the Democrats. According to the independent senator from Vermont, Bernie Sanders, this is the time that we really need to make louder noises. And also, it is time we need to examine the word democracy within the U.S. Under the Trump administration, we've seen the policies change from the left to the right, and also people are quite anxious and worried about the international relationships. How do we understand that under Donald Trump, the policies will change in order to make more positive effects around the world? Or is it time we need to think about another direction for the country? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Professor Kurt Weyland. Professor Weyland's research interest focuses on democratization and authoritarian rule, on social policy and policy diffusion, on populism in Latin America and Europe. He has drawn on a range of theoretical and methodological approaches, including insights from cognitive psychology, has done extensive research in various countries such as Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Peru, and his latest book is called Democracy's Resilience to Populism Threat, Countering Global Alarmism. Well, Professor Weyland, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Well, Professor Weyland, as we mentioned before, today, tragically speaking, we're seeing the government shut down, and again, more than 1,000 employees or federal employees continue to, should we say, stay at home or got laid off, and this is rather tragic. But meanwhile, I want to talk about the relationship between U.S. and Venezuela at this moment. And we've seen that under the Trump administration, the rhetoric towards the Venezuelan government has rather been critical and harsh. Can you walk us through how do we understand the relationship between the two countries at this moment? And also, under Trump, what point do you think that his administration is trying to make to the Venezuelan government? Your thoughts?
So what you have to keep in mind is that dictator Maduro in Venezuela stole the presidential election last year, which was very shocking because it was very obvious that the opposition had won in a landslide and Maduro just lied and claimed that he had won. So already the Biden administration was very upset about this, but didn't do very much at the end of its term. Now, Donald Trump has, as a right-winger, always been critical of Venezuela as a left-wing country. And of course, part of his base is Venezuelans or conservative Latinos. And so this is partly driven by domestic considerations as well. And I think there is currently a lot of pressure on Venezuela, mostly under the pretext of fighting drug gangs, because the Venezuelan elite is very clearly involved in international drug trafficking. So that is correct. They're not the hugest players in the international drug trade, but it provides Donald Trump with a nice pretext to put pressure on them, roll out the American Navy to cruise around the borders of Venezuela. Now, but of course, Maduro has to fear that either the U.S. pressure would lead some of the domestic Venezuelan elite to split off and kind of offer Maduro's head to Trump to diminish that pressure, or that Trump would actually do a commando raid into Venezuela or a drone hit to take out Maduro. I think the latter is very unlikely because the risk would be very high that this fails. I think a full-scale invasion is practically out of the question because while Maduro is a highly illegitimate dictator, he does have domestic support for all kinds of reasons, a certain level. And so it would be very risky for the United States to really invade. I think it would be quite risky to do a commando operation to capture the guy. But Maduro is clearly void, and of course uses it for its own purposes to crack down further on any potential dissent in Venezuela. And so what you see again is the typical pattern of polarization, that Maduro is a convenient enemy for Trump, and Trump is a convenient enemy for Maduro. And so I think we're going to see a continuing standoff there, with continuing Venezuelan boats get blown out of the water, but I do not really foresee huge escalation and full clash.
Professor Weyland, again, as I mentioned in the intro, now today, domestically speaking, voters are very concerned about the direction of the country. I mean, again, this is not the first time that this nation faced a government shutdown. Again, it happened during the first Trump presidency, and of course also happened during Obama presidency. But coming back to what's happening right now, I think within the political field, or you're the expert, Professor Weyland, we tend to think about the word grand strategy. Now, at this moment, again, we've seen that how Donald Trump threw himself and delved into the issue of the Middle East, and also right now he's entangled or continue to wrestle the issue on the war in Ukraine. But from your perspective, again, going back to even the book that you wrote, how do we understand the grand strategy for Donald Trump at this moment, and why is it concerning?
So it is kind of odd to talk about grand strategy in the case of Donald Trump, because Donald Trump has some very basic reflexive orientations, nationalism, America first, this certain predilection for autocratic foreign rulers. But Donald Trump, like the typical populist leader, doesn't really have a very clear strategy. I mean, populist leaders are very personalistic. They shoot from the hip. They contradict each other from one day to the next. They try something and back off. And you see that very much in the case of Donald Trump in Russia, right? I mean, a few days ago, he was supposedly going to... he had supposedly had a 2-hour telephone call with Putin, and it was all going wonderfully, and the end of the war was in sight. And then there was the idea they would meet in Budapest and have a big meeting, and that would lead finally to the art of the deal and all this stuff. And then the whole thing is off because Russia didn't respond at all. The Russian demands remained exactly the same, as provocative as ever, as hardline as ever. So then Donald Trump just makes a 180-degree turn and finally imposes some reasonably serious sanctions on Russia. And so grand strategy, I mean, you see this is very haphazard. This is very kind of arbitrary in some sense. It is, I think, very amateurish, right? I mean, to have this idea that a telephone call with Putin would sort things out because Donald Trump is the art maker of the deal. Of course, he fell on his face there because Putin just waits the man out and manipulates him and gives him a little kind of, indication there could be a compromise, while Putin has no interest in doing that. And Donald Trump just falls into the trap and then kind of is embarrassed because nothing comes of it and then turns around. So kind of grand strategy is conspicuous by its absence in many ways, and that is typical of populist leaders, very, very typical. The Trump deal in the Middle East that he tried to engineer right before his unsuccessful bid for the Nobel Peace Prize, had a big success in the release of hostages and the release of prisoners. But that deal was so badly negotiated and so badly hatched out, and with so many loose ends and so many important questions that were not settled at all, that what you are seeing is, as soon as the hostages have been released and the initial kind of glamour came off, you see that this whole peace deal, I think, unraveling, because Hamas doesn't want to disarm. They can't come up with the bodies of hostages. You saw the Israeli parliament, literally poking Donald Trump in the eye with this vote on annexing part of the West Bank. And so this whole grand deal that they made the biggest deal about the greatest fanfare essentially was a very short-term deal that was significant, but a lot of show and a lot of theater, which again is very typical of populist leaders. They like the grand gesture and the big announcement and the big celebration of their own, prowess and grandeur and wisdom. And very often there isn't actually very much on the ground that is sustainable and that actually works out. And the big initial announcement is often followed by very weak enactment, especially weak implementation, weak preparation, weak sustainability, and we see exactly that. And that is, again, very typical. Right-wing, left-wing populism. When we're talking about Venezuela had the left-wing populist Hugo Chavez, exactly the same pattern. Grand announcements, very little actual effect and long-term sustainability. And that is just so grand strategy, as I said, is really not what populist leaders pursue, because they think they have this intuition and they can just figure out and, they can change their mind and whatever. So,
Professor Weyland, again, since Donald Trump appeared on this political stage, and we know that, and of course for a fact, that he has no background of politics. I mean, he's a businessman, right? I mean, we call him, and of course he, regardless what we say, but he had this book called The Art of Deal, and he constantly looks for deals. But if I can interpret or even translate the word deal into another word, then perhaps you understand better in politics, is the word reciprocity. People believe that for Donald Trump or for his Trump administration, any policies put into action domestically or internationally, it's all about reciprocity. And today, when we look at, especially again from the international affairs, to Putin, to China, to Viktor Orban, or to any other European leaders, why do you think that the leaders within the populism, or what we say the leaders within their own desire, always tend to focus on reciprocity? I mean, how does that, do you think, is going to influence his strategy, especially when we talk about international relationships? Your thoughts?
So if I may disagree, I do not see the Trump approach as based on genuine reciprocity. It is bullying, it is pushing, it is threatening, it is blackmailing, it is extorting. It's not reciprocity like, hi, let's sit down and make a fair deal, and you get something and we get something. I mean, the whole Trump style, whether he deals with countries just imposing tariffs whenever he likes and imposing them in a very arbitrary kind of way, whether it is with research universities, essentially blackmailing them for concessions, whether it is with domestic adversaries. I mean, it's not a deal like we usually understand a deal. I mean, we understand a deal as both sides getting something, a fair compromise that should be sustainable, real reciprocity in that kind of meaning. That is not the Trump approach at all. And once again, it's typical of populists because they are domineering, they are full of themselves, they think that they should get their way and that other people should just concede and agree to their demands. And so, if you talk about deal, I mean, it is a deal essentially pushing the other side to the wall. That bullying is just typically Donald Trump. And so, as I say, I don't really see, kind of the reciprocity. I mean, even the deal that he brokered with Israel was essentially called up Netanyahu and said, if you don't give in, we're just going to let you hang in the air, right? It wasn't like, oh, let's have a negotiation, but like, essentially push, bully.
But Professor Weyland, let's take one step further. Let's just say Donald Trump is running on the strategy of bullying, and pushing. But in reality, Professor Weyland, he still has fans. I mean, again, looking other nation, again, recently I started to pay more attention. Again, you know this better than I do. what's happening in the nation of Italy? I mean, under the current prime minister, Giorgia Meloni, she's almost running on the same train wreck as Donald Trump's continue to push for tighter regulations on immigrations, or we're looking at this economic policy. So again, from your perspective, even though we're seeing the bifurcation in America and also this uncertainty of global economic projection, but why do you think that people like Donald Trump, or why do you think the leader running on the similar principle still continue to enlarge the fan base, and also people continue, I don't want to use the word celebrate, but let's say to support such strategy? Why do you think it's happening today?
So when you say he's increasing his fan base, I'm not that sure. I mean, clearly he has like-minded leaders in other countries because, populism and right-wing ideology has spread. And so there are people like Viktor Orban and Milei in Argentina, and these people who admire him and who try to use a similar kind of approach. But I mean, what you also see is, and it's not voiced as openly, but I'm sure a lot of the European politicians and leaders just despise and hate the guy because he pushes them around so much and he berates them. And so overall, I think the net popularity of Donald Trump on the world stage is, I think, way more clearly negative than it is among Americans in this country. And I mean, you have bold leaders that try a new approach often find imitators and emulators in other countries. I mean, I'm German, fascist Mussolini, later National Socialist Adolf Hitler found imitators across Europe and other countries in the world, in Brazil, Perón in Argentina, across Europe. So even kind of the worst leaders can find fans and imitators, and that doesn't necessarily mean that much. Partly, I mean, when you think of it, extremists in other countries are happy that they have a president like Donald Trump, because that in some sense legitimates them and normalizes them and makes them look not just like some weirdo in their own country, but, well, they're doing similar things in the US. I think there was one factor why in the 2018 election in Brazil, hard right populist Jair Bolsonaro won. I mean, Bolsonaro had been a completely stigmatized, marginalized outsider. But I think in Brazil it was like, well, if Americans can vote for Trump, why can't we vote for Bolsonaro? And so these leaders, especially kind of the most extreme leaders, they are happy about somebody like Trump and use that to legitimate and normalize themselves. But I don't think that means that the Trump approach is broadly catching on. And what you also have is he serves as a very powerful deterrent effect. A lot of people say the worst thing that can happen to our country would be Donald Trump. What we need to do is we need to avoid this kind of thing at all costs. I wonder how that will play out, for example, in the 2027 presidential election in France, when Marine Le Pen probably will, or her young underling Bardella will try to be the presidential candidate. It might well hurt these people.
Professor Weyland, I know your time is very precious. I do want to ask you the last question. Again, going back to what's happening today in the U.S. Again, we've seen this political polarization within the country. Both Democrats and Republicans are still trying to figure out the strategies to deal with each other, again, to avoid the further government shutdown. But meanwhile, let's talk about another pair, Bernie Sanders, the independent senator for Vermont, and also AOC. It's a well-known popular representative, especially the younger generation's voice. Those two have been on a tour, what they called Fight Oligarchy Tour. And also those two have been actively voicing their opinions or their views on the future for the country and also the future for even for the globalism. Now, Professor Weyland, from your perspective, at this moment, how do we assess the extra noises or the extra voices, such as AOC, such as Bernie Sanders? And how do you think that voters today, or especially the international audience, to understand this direction for the country? Your final thoughts.
So this is another aspect of the polarization in this country. What you see is, a right-wing assault by somebody like Donald Trump, who is supported by a whole bunch of other billionaires, and of course, in some sense, empowers and inspires more left-wing sectors in the opposition party very clearly. You see that also in the New York mayoral candidate Mamdani, right? So that would be a problematic direction for the Democratic Party to take. You see the dynamic of, it was that dynamic of polarization that misled the British Labour Party into going towards the left and enabling Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s to get re-elected. And so in many ways, I personally hope that this will not catch on all that much, because if the Democrats want to win in the 2026 midterm election and take over the House, and if they want to win in the presidential election of 28, I think it is very, very important to win over independents. The striking thing is that Donald Trump, despite all his haphazard policymaking, has maintained incredibly high support among Republicans. You're not going to make inroads there. So any election needs to be won by mobilizing and winning over independents. And I think that is very important. And I don't think that the Bernie Sanders AOC kind of appeals would do a lot to mobilize the Democratic base, and it could deter these independents who are middle of the road, who are not already decided, who are not ideological. And if you have a loud left-wing message, they might say, well, we stay home, we're not going to support the Democrats. And so I'm concerned that this left wing of the Democratic Party, for example, with the likely mayoral win of Mamdani, might get a boost and support, and that might actually end up hurting the chances to defeat Trump and his illiberal assault in 26 and then in 2028.
Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, such an honor to speak to Professor Kurt Weyland. Again, Professor Weyland research focuses on democratization and also authoritarian rules on social policy and the policy diffusion. And his latest book is called Democracy's Resilience to Populism Threat, Countering Global Alarmism. Well, Professor Weyland, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. We'll love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay closer attention to the global affairs. So thank you so much for doing this.